See this?
Yes, perfect. All right, well, welcome everyone to another edition of the ISPP's Eastern Hemisphere Seminar Series. This time we'll be speaking with Karim Bettache. He did his PhD here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Then he taught at Monash University, Malaysia. And just recently, he returned to teach right back here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's going to be presenting on a very interesting topic that comes from his own experience and the interests that created, but I'll let him give that part of the talk. We will let Karim present, and then at the end we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Karim.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much. Well, welcome in this small group today, which is nice. I don't mind. So I'm going to talk a bit about the skin color and colorism in Asia, and it's based on a paper that I recently published in Perspectives on Psychological Science. Well, let me just start first, because Peter already said it, like what made me so interested in this topic, because often people ask me that question, why are you so interested in that? And it has many personal reasons, and in particular with personal experiences during my lifetime, that it really has shaped my interest in issues of discrimination and colorism and racism. And that has first, of course, to do with my own personal background. I come from the Netherlands. I'm Dutch. My father is Algerian, my mother is Dutch. And while I myself look more like my European side, as a little child, I always wondered, why do bad people, and why do people who are evil and stuff in movies, why are they always darker? I asked myself that question one time, like, how far does this interest go back? And I realized already as a child, I wondered, when I watched Hollywood movies, why darker people are always bad, and why the good people and the heroes are always light-skinned and in particular white. There was something that already struck me, and I think it also has a reason, of course, because my father's side, my Algerian side, the people are more darker, you know. So for me, that was very, very weird as a child. And then I started living across the world, and I saw that skin color actually plays a tremendous role wherever I go. Okay, so I've lived in Malaysia, I've lived in Hong Kong, I've traveled around Asia, and of course I lived in Europe. And I noticed that, and in particular in Asia, that skin color is such a pervasive phenomenon in every aspect of life, while at the same time people don't really seem to talk about it. It's very interesting. And when I was in Malaysia, what struck me immediately was that I saw literal hierarchies in society. So when I walked around, I was looking around, and what I really noticed was the lower status job you would go, and then I mean lower status job, I mean the more outdoor hard work for lower pay. Often what you would see is the darker the skin color. And the higher the job, the higher the position, socioeconomic status, the lighter the skin color, which really started to increasingly like touched on that fascination of mine. Another very important reason of mine is that I have an African American friend who lives in Hong Kong, and he many times discusses with me his experiences as a black man in Hong Kong, which sometimes are very troubling, I must say, also triggering that interest. And finally, often confessions from my own students. I had lots of chats with my Chinese students, especially the females, who told me how important skin color has been in their lives growing up as a girl in this part of the world. So all these things taken together, plus my interest in the social sciences and psychology, really triggered this interest. So why do we have colorism? Okay, why do we have colorism? In mainstream psychology, that would revolve around a couple of very well-known constructs, such as prejudice, Stereotypes, discrimination, prejudice, the bias feeling you have towards certain people, positive or negative. Stereotypes, the schemas you have about other people based on their color. And discrimination, okay, the way you treat them based on their skin color. So for many years, psychology has treated issues of discrimination as an individual problem. Political psychological research, for example, by the renowned John Jost, would argue that racism is a form of innate psychological resistance to a changing environment and a fear of outside threats. Okay. So it's really situated in the individual. Oh, you're a very fearful person and therefore you are racist, for example. Other studies will gauge unconscious biases also within the individual without questioning where these biases come from, besides them being situated in the individual. The result is that also solutions become individualized in the form of, for example, bias training that attempts to change individual cognitions. Or from the other side, for example, a therapy for the victims of discrimination to deal with their perceptions of other people's behavior towards them. But what does a bias training help if a person successfully graduating a bias course goes back into the world where the media still portrays darker skinned people as the boogeyman, where darker skinned individuals occupy predominantly lower paid jobs because of structural discrimination on the job market, where billboards only show light-skinned women, and where the education system mostly seems to celebrate Western white scholars instead of those from the global South. Exactly. The bias training probably gets nullified and the biased cognitions re-emerge in the mind. It is for this reason that merely psychological approach on human tendencies of discrimination, whether it's based on race, skin color, gender, or any other categorical distinction, is in my opinion reductionist. Group level social sciences, such as sociology or the political sciences, need to be combined with the psychological to get an understanding of how these inequality enhancing tendencies of human beings are still so prevalent and resistant to change. That brings me to one form of categorical discrimination: colorism. I've always been very fascinated with the question why darker skinned human beings are discriminated while light skinned Europeans are pretty much never discriminated. Maybe some name calling here and there, but ethnic Europeans seem to be the only group of which we can find no evidence of any systemic discrimination because of their race or skin color. This fascinated me, and I wondered why my Western psychological education had no problem talking about racism and skin color discrimination and the resulting racial and color hierarchies, with white people always on top, but never delved into the question why this is and where this comes from. By ignoring that question, psychology unwittingly naturalizes racial and colorist hierarchies. That is, by simply reiterating in psychological studies that one group always seems to be perceived more positively than another, without ever questioning the roots of this hierarchy, psychological studies assume this as normal and a stable characteristic of human behavior, as naturally arising in some, if not most, individuals. So if you look at the screen, you see here an IAT score across the world. So I had to cut the graph because it pretty much does pretty much all countries in the world. But I have the majority of countries here. And what you can see is very interesting. None of the societies have a pro-black bias. Okay, IAT is the implicit association test, most of you will know. And all countries have a pro-white bias. Now, of course, we can discuss about how valid the IAT test is, but let's forget about that discussion for a moment. It is still interesting that you all everywhere see a pro-white bias. And now even more interesting, the highest scoring countries are Singapore, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Italy, Malta, China, Hong Kong. So in other words, except a few European countries, China, Hong Kong, and Singapore have the strongest pro-white bias of the world. Okay, so this is something to think about. Again, in my mind arises the question, why is this? Why is it that all across the world we see a pro-white bias? When reading this paper from Couts, very recent paper from 2020, it's amazing, but this question is not answered. It's simply stating that all over the world we have a pro-white bias and we need to find some ways to do something against discrimination. Very watered down, not trying to get to the roots why a pro-white bias is spread all over the world. That is typical psychology. Okay, we have this very mainstream psychological view. You have the perpetrator of discrimination engaging in direct action. Think about name calling, think about mistreating people because of their skin color, or we do it in a very indirect differential treatment. For example, think about avoiding looking people in their eyes because they have dark skin, avoiding them in the train, on the streets, and so forth. So what psychology, the mainstream view does, is that it situates the discriminatory behavior into the individual. So it's an intentional thing coming from an individual, almost abstracted from the social environment. So, in my opinion, this is something that is not satisfying. Okay, maybe this had been satisfying for many decades before, when our science was very much almost isolated within the West, but now with increasing influences from the rest of the world, also more contextual influences such as cultural psychology in Asia, this is something that is not very satisfactory. So what is a cultural approach then? Well, a cultural approach is not like in the old days that you just measure prejudice and colorism across cultures. It also isn't that we check how colorism is learned at the mother's knee. It is instead that we consider colorism as a cultural pattern. Okay, so the culture influences the psyche, and the psyche, the aggregate of psyches within a society, influence the culture. Okay, so the way we think about skin color, the way we think about race comes from our culture, and we as human beings together reproduce these cultural tendencies. So we should see colorism and racism as a cultural pattern, okay? A system of advantage and disadvantage based on social, historical, and cultural constructions of race and ethnicity, and I should say here also skin color. And this consists of patterns of historically derived and selected ideas and their material instantiation in institutions, practices, artifacts, and other manifestations of mind in context. So historically derived is very important here. Okay, it doesn't just, we're not born with it, it comes from nothing and suddenly we are colorist or racist, but it's historically derived because of the development our societies went through. And this, and we're talking about selected ideas, okay, ideas that survived thousands of years of cultural evolution, or hundreds of years of cultural evolution, I should say, in the case of colorism or racism. And their material instantiation in institution, practices, and artifacts. Okay, think about education, the way education treats people from different races or skin color, the media, beauty, fairy tales, and so forth. These are these artifacts in culture that reproduce all these colorist patterns. So if we study history, sociology, and also critical theory within the political sciences, such as post-colonialism, we can understand where these tendencies most likely come from. So why is this? Why do you and I live in a day and age where since birth we are being taught that a lack of sun protection in your skin implies that one is better, prettier, cleaner, and more innocent than someone who has more efficient protection against the harsh sunlight? If this is a natural thing, if this opinion of us is a natural thing, has this not always been the case then? If this is a natural human tendency, then we can go back thousands of years in history and see the same tendency that has remained unchanged until today. So let's do that. Let's check that out. What are the roots of colorism? The exact origins seem to be unclear. According to Jablonski, who has written a lot about that, skin color has been abundantly described in historical texts, but there were no connotations of superiority or inferiority based on skin color pre-European colonization, okay, before European colonization. Roman, Greek, and Egyptians preferred a medium brown skin color. So again, we're not talking about the value as a human being. We're just talking purely aesthetically. Interestingly also, and this must be somewhere between the 700s and 1400s, so pretty recently during the Arab Empire, Arabs preferred Eastern Ethiopian females and considered them as the most beautiful. This shows the arbitrariness of beauty and attraction and challenges the assumption that taste is in the eye of the beholder. In fact, taste, I would say, is largely shaped by culture. Okay? Ethiopian women are what we would now consider, well, one of the most dark-skinned women in the world. Take obesity as an example. In classic Europe, being obese was a signifier of wealth, while being slim indicated poverty. In those days, people could not imagine that the body type that we like today was considered attractive. Similarly, it is hard for us to understand that obesity was considered feminine beauty. Ancient texts suggest the same for skin color. Furthermore, during the Arab Empire, slavery was not connected to blackness as we see it today or recently during European colonization. In fact, the Arab Empire was known for both black and white slaves. While a general sense of Arab superiority did exist, mostly this sense of superiority was tied to culture, religion, and language. Racialized thinking as we know it today, introduced by Europeans, did not exist until then. Similarly, the ancient Romans did not think in racial terms, but also in linguistic and cultural terms. Unsurprisingly, Europe had black Roman rulers, and archaeological evidence shows that black people intermarried with white English people thousands of years ago. Again, don't forget that I use the term black and white, but keep in mind that these are invented categories that we know today, but were non-existent pre-European colonialism. It was approximately around 1700 that Western Europeans started to dominate the global system and the slave trade. It was during this time that racialized thinking tied to colorism became rampant. To justify the domination of other people, what one calls white supremacist cultural ideology emerged, which posits that people classified as European white have the right and should dominate the colored people, also called the white man's burden. In psychology, we call this a way to rationalize your cognitive dissonance. If you would perceive people you oppress as fully human and equal to yourself, then their enslavement and colonial domination would feel morally wrong. So, to combat this dissonance, you position your victims as inferior to wash away the guilt one feels when abusing them and stealing their country's resources. Now, let's be clear. Europeans did, of course, not rule because of some exceptional superiority. Historical development at that specific time, approximately 500 years ago, made everything fall into place in such a way that Europeans could create great ships and guns that made it easier to dominate other human beings. Just as the Middle East, think about Assyria or Mesopotamia, found superior way of agriculture back in the day, which made them the center of the world for hundreds of years. Earlier, Other empires, for example, were first with the domestication of animals, which made them so-called superior for hundreds of years. So in other words, power and dominance go from one group to the other during the course of history. And we are currently in the aftermath of European or Western dominance. European colonialism was so different from all of the other forms of imperial domination in that A, it spread all over the world, and B, just like religion, they imprinted white supremacist ideology into the minds of colonized peoples, which we are all to an extent suffering from today, both Europeans and non-Europeans. That brings me to Asia. Asia was a bit of an outlier compared to other colonized parts of the world. As in Asia, also in societies that were not colonized, such as Japan, there was a local form of colorism. Ancient Chinese drawings from approximately 690 CE show that Chinese royal females were drawn with very pale skin. In other words, just as obesity in classic Europe, pale skin signified wealth because one did not need to go outside to work in the sun. The same beauty symbol existed in Renaissance Europe, where pale skin was a signifier of beauty, as you can see on the picture on the right. Notice that colorism here is within group discrimination, which is different than between group colonial style racial discrimination, okay? So you have within group, within an ethnic group based on color, but you can also have between group racial discrimination. European intra-group colorism has largely disappeared. Again, here you see the flexibility and changeability of beauty standards again. Because in Europe, tan medium brown skin became a signifier of beauty. Why? Because increasingly it became hard for elites to distinguish themselves based on a pale skin color, as it is very easy for Europeans to remain this color also for poorer Europeans when they start to avoid the sun. What is harder, however, is having the leisure time to go to warm countries and the beach and get a serious suntan when you are less wealthy. So a tan skin became a signifier of beauty because it showed you had the means to spend time in the tropics and on the beach. In Asia, the colorist trend does not seem to have evolved yet. The Indian caste system is still highly colorist. Similarly, in China or South Korea, females are still extremely obsessed with maintaining fair skin, and increasingly, at least in Korea, also men. In other words, it seems to be culturally reproduced until today. Again, psychological research would often measure colorist tendencies within individuals without questioning the larger social, cultural, socio-historical context. Sociological research does indeed show that the Asian media system is highly biased towards lightness of skin color and against darker skin colors. Think about the portrayal of beautiful women or criminal men in movies. Similarly, in sociological research, young Asian females have expressed that they feel intense pressure from family members to maintain fair skin. Many of them express how mothers, aunties, or grandmothers are obsessed with their skin color. In fact, in the US, one can observe a cultural clash where young Asians want to get a Western style tan, which often results in them being scolded for it by their family members. Again, this shows the crucial importance of culture when it comes to colorism, as biculturalism seems to literally result in opposing views on skin color valuation. Reading all these accounts and seeing public life around me indeed gives one the sentiment that skin color is a deep-rooted obsession in many facets of many Asian societies. That brings me to the introduction of colonialism that spearheaded colorism in Asia to such an extent that may explain why skin color discrimination seems to be the most extreme and severe in Asia when comparing to the rest of the world. And we remember the IAT I showed you in the beginning. So with colonialism, Europeans violently subdued local populations and introduced their own racist, white supremacist system on top of local colorism. And this resulted most likely in an interaction between racism and colorism in Asian societies that suffered under both of these kind of systems. That is, positioning racial groups with lighter skin above racial groups of a darker skin color, with Europeans, of course, on top, while within group also preferring lighter skinned in group members. To give an example, prolific sociologists from the Netherlands, such as Professor Jan Breeman or Professor Wertheim, have intensively researched how Dutch colonization in Indonesia created psychological inferiority into local Indonesians by instituting a Western-style education system that celebrates only European accomplishment and at the same time indoctrinated a sense of worthlessness into Indonesians by teaching that their dark skin was a signifier of racial backwardness and therefore they needed to be civilized and modernized by the colonizer. Interviews with elderly people who lived during colonial times tell us how deeply psychologically damaging this was to the locals. They often hated themselves and wished to be white or at least married to a white man or white woman. This problem seems to be generational, as second, third, and fourth generation Dutch Indonesians still struggle with severe psychological issues in relation to their ethnic background. A second way this was done was through religious imagery, by portraying God and angels as typical European whites, and at the same time have local people convert to Christianity and pray to them. Psychologically, a sense of inferiority would be instilled in local peoples. And of course, there was the blatant violence in which the local populations were often forced into Christianity. Taking this all together, of course, created deep and long-lasting cultural scars that created societies deeply entrenched in colorist thinking, to such an extent that colonized and former colonized people humiliate and discriminate fellow victims while preferentially treating those who look like the former colonizer. This is a phenomenon one sees until today. Until today, those who look European are treated mostly with exceptional preference in Asia, regardless of which country, while those who also suffered under European colonialism, for example, Black people, are often shunned, avoided, and looked down on in many places in Asia, regardless of the fact that Africans have never harmed Asians during the course of history, unlike the unspeakable harms done by European colonization. So that brings me to colorism in psychological science. As you can see, in psychology, colorism has received very little attention. In my opinion, maybe even unsurprisingly, because the science originated from the same education system that was formed during colonial times. It is highly biased towards Western thinking and often ignores the plight and suffering of descendants of colonized peoples. In fact, even when studying discrimination, psychology tends to only focus on the variables that motivate the perpetrator, but hardly ever on the psychology of the victim. So, what is important when we try to understand
Hi.
Yeah, it looks like Kareem's screen is frozen.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can
Maybe.
contact him.
Yeah.
Could be a software crash on his end.
Yeah.
Oh, you're back. Karim, sorry, you were cut off there for about 30 seconds. Could you just kind of go
Yes.
back?
Oh, that's strange. Okay. Yeah. So let me see. What was the last part you heard?
You were just introducing this table about how within traditional psychology, colorism has been an understudied topic.
Okay. So let me see. Yeah. So as you can see in the table, if you compare it to collectivism, colorism has got very, very marginal attention. So why is it so important that we try to understand colorism as not simply situated in individuals, but rather that it is situated and reproduced in our cultural environment? None of us are born colorist or racist. I think this is a very important aspect to really understand. Okay, if you do tests with newborn babies or with local populations, indigenous populations in places where they have had no contact with Westerners or Western media, you do not see colorism. And again, when we go back thousands of years, it also was not there for most of the time. So none of us are born colorist or racist, yet most of us do get affected by it in some way, shape, or form. Why? Because we are social beings who cannot live closed off from our environment. Continuous reproduction of racial and colorist hierarchies in our environment shape the way we think, whether we want it or not. Hence, I have argued that to understand skin color discrimination in Asia, we need to adopt a cultural psychological approach where culture continuously influences our mind and where the aggregate of our minds in turn influence culture. Take Hong Kong sitcoms as an example, where light-skinned women are continuously being imprinted into our psyche, into the psyche of the viewers, as the standards of worthy and beautiful Hong Kong women. This happens continuously on a day-to-day basis, shaping the minds of viewers in such a way that they want to look like that. Collectively, if a whole society abides by these norms, they reproduce them and as such influence culture. This is a continuously recurring spiral until people start to actively question and resist such cultural norms. Hence, work on cultural priming may play an important role. Our cultural environment continuously reproduces racial and color hierarchies through media, education, upbringing, etc., that they become cultural schemas that get primed every time one encounters relevant cultural cues. Think about going into a makeup store, which primes commercials of light-skinned women, resulting in Asian girls putting on foundation way too light for their natural skin color. Or think about coming across dark-skinned African or Indian men and feeling fear, not because they have been bad to you, not because you had bad experiences with them, but because of the activation of mental cultural schemas when seeing their natural skin color. In other words, their skin color has been conditioned in your mind with negative information produced in one's culture through media, upbringing, education, and so forth. Therefore, there is this tremendous opening here for people in Asia, in particular former colonized people, to investigate this phenomenon of colorism and racism much more rigorously by taking culture into account and as such unpack the roots of colorism. For example, we can investigate if there is an interaction between racism and colorism in former colonized societies as opposed to those who were not. The Philippines, for example, was victimized by both colorism and racism during American and Spanish colonization. This imprinted the idea that whites were on top, mixed people were in the middle, and indigenous people were at the bottom. Until today, one sees that many people from the Philippines, especially women, will emphasize that they are mixed because of the deep scars left by the imposed inferiority feelings related to being fully indigenous. It would be interesting to see if in such societies like the Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, or Indonesia, you not only see colorism, but also stronger negative attitudes towards darker skinned ethnic groups such as Indians or sub-Saharan Africans compared to a country such as Japan, where colonialism was absent. Preliminary studies suggest that this indeed may be the case, as a recent paper that cited my article did indeed show that anti-blackness is much less strong in Japan as compared to former colonized Asian countries, while at the same time still preferring lighter skin for Japanese women. So, therefore, acculturation research becomes very important to understand colorism and racism. While Western psychology has remained focused on safe and very colorblind constructs, one could say, such as collectivism and individualism, acculturation research may be applied to unpack why we are still reproducing colorism and European-style racism. As the Asian American authors of the paper you see on your screen, as they wrote, in America, for example, everyone is acculturated into white supremacist culture because of many facets of American culture: education, politics, media, fashion, and so forth make Americans internalize white supremacy, the idea that white people are superior, on top, better, beautiful, and so forth. The authors, Asian Americans, by the way, the authors go on to explain how this white supremacy instills superiority, feelings of superiority within people classified as white, while at the same time it instills inferiority into people classified as non-white. In other words, acculturation affects us all, but the way it does is dependent on one's phenotype, such as skin color, because of colorist and racialized associations that are embedded into our culture. I argue that this does not only apply to the US, but to the whole world. The whole world consumes Western media that is biased towards whiteness, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Hollywood. Global media is entrenched with a bias towards whiteness and often paired with the demonization of darker skinned human beings, reproducing on a global scale in local cultures white supremacist thinking and therefore white supremacist global cultures. So how can we study these cultural effects in relation to psychology? Well, for example, through cultural priming. What do Chinese cultural primes do with regards to female sense of attractiveness when taking their phenotype into account? Think about skin color. Or does manipulating the racial group of a target individual in a social judgment study influence the way we are judged when we are judging when taking colonial heritage of the participant into account? Okay, think about a moral transgression by an African person versus a European white man and how this is judged. One could add to this the potential mediation of historical knowledge. Glenn Adams, for example, has shown that in the US, knowledge of the history of US slavery attenuates discriminatory and racist tendencies of participants. The same could be done in Asia with regards to a good dose of knowledge of what colonization really entailed, instead of the watered down and indoctrinated idea of modernization and civilization. Indeed, if this whole idea of modernization and civilization were true, then the global South would not be so poor, while the former colonizing countries are also very rich. Studying colorism also necessitates the revaluation of qualitative research, something that is much more appreciated in the non-psychological social sciences, such as sociology. What are the cultural characteristics Asians feel that contribute to their colorist tendencies? But also, what does it do to the victims of colorism, in particular the darker skinned ones? How does it make them feel? What are the cognitions that get triggered when they think about skin color? While the method is subjective, ignoring qualitative research, as we often see in hegemonic empirical psychology, unintentionally neglects and ignores the deep psychological struggles that may come with growing up in cultures of colorism. Another important method to consider is intersectionality research, in which we may be able to study the interaction between within group colorism and between group colorism, for example. By manipulating both race and skin color, we can see if there are mutually reinforcing effects and if they are dependent on culture. Think about colonial versus non-colonial cultures. Take a Singaporean dark-skinned Chinese girl, for example. The way she perceives herself or is treated by fellow Singaporeans may be worse than a light-skinned Singaporean Chinese, but at the same time better than a dark-skinned Indian Singaporean because of the racial stigma attached to the Indian lady on top of the colorist social judgment. This indeed has to do with the colonial heritage of Singapore, where during British rule, Indians were positioned lower on the social hierarchy by the British than the Chinese and the Malays. So, to wrap it up, although we are living in an era of extreme globalization, wherein the intermixing of ethnic groups has never before been so widespread, colorism seems to paradoxically become ever more prevalent. So it is surprising, if not very distressing, that there is hardly any scholarly work on such a socially relevant phenomenon within mainstream psychological science. With this talk, I hope to motivate researchers to start a serious investigation into colorism in Asia, because insight into the psychological causes and effects of colorism may prove essential in providing solutions to a situation of severe social inequality based on skin color among Asians, both within and between ethnic groups. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Great talk. I'm very happy to be the moderator here because I get to abuse my position and ask you the first question.
Oh, wow.
Maybe stopping the recording.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you so much for reminding me.